Good morning, everyone. We're about to begin, so can I request all of you to take your seats? And if you could just tell everyone outside that we're beginning. Thank you all for being here this morning. Um, and a very warm welcome to everyone for the second day of the CPR Dialogues. We start today with a discussion on energy. This panel is titled Understanding India's Energy Transitions in a Global Context. It's a chatty group. And as I said yesterday, I am an authoritarian Democrat. Very nice to have you now. Sit down. so, it's an absolute pleasure for us to welcome today the chair of our session, Mr. Ajay Mathur, who's the Director General of the Energy and Resource Institute, STERI. Ajay needs no introduction, but thank you very much for being here and for being kind enough to chair the session. We are absolutely delighted also to have in our midst Professor Michael Grubb, who's made it here especially for the dialogues. A very warm welcome to you, Michael, and thank you very much. It was very important for us as we were conceiving of this dialogues to locate the Indian conversation within a global context, because we felt that India is not alone in many of the transitions it's facing, and much of what's happening in India and the policy dialogues and discussions are in many ways influenced by what's happening in the globe, but we talk about that very little. So your presence here is very important, particularly in terms of trying to push the Indian audience to locate some of its questions in the global context. Thanks a lot for being here. Just to introduce you, Professor Grubb is a professor of energy and climate change at the Institute of Sustainable Resources at the University College of London. In 2016, he moved from a role as senior advisor at the UK energy regulator, OFGEM, to chair the UK government's panel of technical advisors on energy market reform. His former positions include Senior Research Associate in Economics at Cambridge University, Chair of the International Research Organization Climate Strategies, Chief Economist at the Carbon Trust, and Head of Energy and Environment at Chatham House. A very warm welcome to you, Michael, and thank you for being here. We also have Navroz Dubash, Professor at CPR, and Radhika Khosla, Research Director, Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development, University of Oxford, but more importantly, Visiting Fellow at the Centre for Policy Research, and Ashok Srinivas, Senior Fellow from Prayas, who will be joining us in the discussion this morning. Thank you very much, and over to you, Ajay, to start the session.
Thanks ever so much. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I think it's a great idea of having these dialogues.
I think you will have to use
I think I didn't switch this on. Is this better now? Yes. Okay. So, first of all, delighted to be here, and all congratulations to CPR for organizing the dialogues and focusing on, as in the present case, something that we don't normally get into, the international context within which our climate dialogues are situated. It's great that Michael is here. Michael has been a leader intellectual leader in the discussion around climate, around what we need to do to address the climate issues for a very long time. Michael, it must have been, what, the early 80s when you wrote the Cinderella paper? End of the 80s. Well, neither you have hair nor I have hair, so it speaks of our vintage. But for many of us, Michael's paper, and I strongly recommend that you read it, which focused on what were called the Cinderella options. And what were the Cinderella options? Renewables, which I think has lived up to their promise. But the point that I want to make is, if you're looking at tomorrow, we look through the lens of a lot of turbulence, transition as it's called. But the ability to look through it, to see what will be there at the end of it, is, I think, an important, obviously important personal gift, but it's also important to be able to focus the debate towards where we want to be. also great to have Navroz and Radhika here to join Michael in Indianizing the global transition, and to have Ashok with us to focus on comments on what Michael and Navroz and Radhika would focus on. It's really my job, essentially, to keep time. And I will do it with a vengeance. There's nothing I enjoy more than squeezing speakers and keeping them on time. With that, and without further ado, let me turn to Michael and request him to share what is happening in the global world, so that we can then focus on where is it that India can go to, should go to, and has the possibilities to move on. Michael, all yours. And I noticed that this is very well placed today.
Thank you very much, Ajay. From the agenda was offered 35 minutes. I fear I may yet still test your chair's resolve,
really?
Because I've got to pack a fair amount into this. Can everyone see that okay? I know that they tilted it so that we could see it from the platform as well. Unfortunately, you'll soon realise that I do tend to be fairly PowerPoint intensive, though often the data is simply a backdrop to the main points that I want to make. I am actually going to offer you, I'm afraid, a rather incomplete narrative, peppered with various observations of what is going on internationally, but with a particular lens, obviously, from the UK and Europe. And I will offer some tentative thoughts at the end, but there's a lot of ground that I will go through. So what I thought I would do is to say a bit about general international energy trends, a slight more focus, partly just to dispel some myths around relations of energy with wealth and structural change, including the international trade. The first of those is aggregate scale. The second is more per capita, to understand a bit about structure and relative positions. But I'll go through both of those pretty quickly, because I'm going to devote the bulk of, if you like, the analysis to what has been going on in the UK and Europe, and what's happened and how did it happen. And from that, I do want to indeed suggest that we are in the midst, I think, of a revolution which makes kind of prediction very difficult. I will try and not offer predictions, but reflect on future possibilities. I will be drawing upon quite a major book that was now published a few years ago, in which I'd actually tried to step away from all the day-to-day stuff to reflect on what on earth had we learned from what had at least I learned from 20 years in this space. So let me take the first of those, international energy trends. Again, don't worry about the charts. I kind of put them there in case people want to look afterwards at the detail. I've tried to pull out a few points relating to the relationship of OECD and broadly continental Asia, predominantly Asia-Pacific and Southern Asia. In the oil world, oil demand after the 1970s oil shocks that you can see there has continued steadily increasing, but if you like, the composition is that oil consumption has more or less stabilized since the 1970s in the OECD, the rich world, if you like, but has obviously increased enormously in Asia. I think one consequence is particularly when you factor in the US oil shale revolution, is some greater geopolitical decoupling. You now no longer have the US with anything like such a deep strategic interest in the Middle East. You have broadly continental Asia as major oil importers from much of the rest of the world. And I think that over time we will see that the way that plays out in certain geopolitical shifts. In coal, OECD coal is in decline and in accelerating decline over the past decade. And coal is unusual in the extent to which it's now totally dominated by Asian demand, principally because of the extraordinary surge in Chinese consumption up until 2014, when in effect, you might say in desperation, the Chinese government seemed to find ways of putting the brake on coal expansion. And it's hard, I think, particularly for a European, to know what to say sensibly about that. But clearly there are certain vulnerabilities around coal dependence, of which the environmental aspect is, I think, an important one, both, I think, from domestic pressures, but to some extent international as well, whether it's going to be through aspects of trade or, for example, the political pressures in Australia around the Carmichael mine discussions. We see steady rise of gas. OECD, together with Russia, still broadly accounts for the majority of gas consumption. Central Asia, the rest of Asia, much less so, but growing more rapidly. I think maybe I'm overplaying the symbolism, but the fact that Qatar resigned from OPEC a few weeks ago, I think may be symbolic of a decoupling that people have talked about for years, about gas markets decoupling from oil, but I think it is happening politically as well as economically. And along with that, quite interesting that at the Katowice climate negotiations, particularly the debate around welcoming the IPCC report on 1.5, you really saw in more stark terms the sort of the Gang of Four, as it's been called, of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the White House, and Russia, from which Qatar clearly distanced itself, and so did most other gas producers. And actually, I think we're seeing something that I've for a while argued, which is this may be controversial in India, I apologize, but the geopolitics of climate change has been for 25 years conceived as fundamentally north-south, historical equity, etc. Whereas from an economic standpoint, one would say politics always was really about carbon-intensive producers versus the consumers. And I think we are seeing elements of that, if you like, alignment more with economic fault lines emerging. Along with that, we see hydro has always been a modest part of the global energy mix, stabilized in OECD for a long time, grown in Asia. But the really new news on the block of zero carbon, aside from the stalling of nuclear in most regions, is explosive growth of new renewable energy sources. The units there obviously are different. You can overplay, in the excitement, you can overplay the volume. It's still a very small part of the global energy mix. It's not really enough to be visible in sort of the aggregate global emission trends yet. But the pace of growth, I think, has surprised everybody, even Greenpeace and others. And that I will say a little bit more about what's going on in renewables. In effect, the headlines in terms of the actual global energy and CO2 trends are then not surprising. Asia now accounts for over 40% of global energy demand and a disproportionate amount of CO2 emissions, broadly because of the Chinese coal explosion. There was a tantalizing halt in the growth of global CO2 for 2 or 3 years. It was always unclear what that signified. It went up again substantially this year. My own hunch is that Chinese emissions will sort of rattle around for another few years, up and down, before they do go into decline. The global trend is harder, I think, to say what the structural prospects are. I'll come back to that. I did want to add then a look at sort of per capita views and more structural views of how things developed in a slightly unconventional, a slightly complicated way, but it's one that I think does at least give a different lens on thinking about what's happened and where it might go. So this is a chart from quite a substantial project looking at trends, and what we've done is to track, the index here is CO2 emissions, because I'm interested in climate change. It's also a sort of bit of a basket of energy. It's the trend over time, yes, for 50 years, but plotted per capita emissions vertically versus per capita GDP horizontally. So you see that, right up until the oil shocks, this is US, emissions were increasing with wealth just in the way that broadly people tend to assume. You then hit 1973, global recession, bit of backwards on economics, a drop in emissions, 1979, the next little blip there, which really convinced the OECD to try and get oil out of power generation at least, and the growth of nuclear coming in. Actually, per capita emissions in the US then remained pretty stable for the next several decades until the 2008 financial crisis, when they went right down again. Now, there's been a growing narrative that, yeah, but that's actually false, because what really matters from an environmental standpoint and a more, you argue, equity standpoint is the consumption footprint. Well, this is the best estimate of consumption footprint, i.e. how much was the US responsible for through its consumption. And initially the US was actually a net exporter. And over time, during the 1990s, it became a net importer of energy-intensive goods. This is steel, cement, etc., not energy trade. But it's broadly the balance between territorial emission accounts and the footprint accounts. So you can see that in consumption terms, actually, US never did stabilize until the global financial crisis and all that has subsequently happened in international trade, where actually imports have been hit a lot harder relatively than domestic. So the consumption footprint has gone down a lot in the last 10 years, unclear where it's going in the future. But that's the difference between those two. When you then look at Europe, you see in qualitative terms a similar-ish pattern, except the EU has always been a net importer of carbon-intensive goods, but grown massively, but at per capita levels which are less than half of the United States. And there's various big structural reasons for that, again gone down. But, there's many ways you can interpret this, but at least it's not all been going up forever as countries get richer. You could say tentative evidence, debated, of a sort of carbon Kuznets curve, for those who know the economics of that. Of course, a lot of those imported emissions came from China. In per capita terms, the growth of China has been spectacular, but it's basically now where Europe was 50 years ago, in both income and emission levels. Not uninteresting. What I think I do find in some ways more hopeful and interesting is that some of the, you might call advanced emerging economies, have actually reached that kind of critical level between $10,000 and $20,000 per capita at much lower emissions. And in energy terms, at least, not land use, Brazil, I think, probably has the best claim to be a low-carbon economy. Now, in terms of where we go, well, India has lots of choices and options. It's still right down in the left-hand corner of that, and apologies, even if I hadn't traced the data, you could hardly see it, although, again, it's growing fast. The obvious questions, or the obvious issues, perhaps, I think I summarize on the next slide. If you're remotely serious about trying to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement for, well below 2 degrees, clearly you need a rapid acceleration and broadening of the decarbonisation in the industrialised countries, going, I think, beyond renewables to end-use energy demand. And within that, you now have to include China. In emission terms, it is already an fully industrialised country, notwithstanding huge internal differences. one would need countries that are well below $10,000 per capita to avoid, maybe excuse the term, but coal curse when I look at the struggles that countries have had with the coal sector when it's become overdeveloped. And basically to say, we're going to go on a very different path. One of the more ambitious ones is certainly Ethiopia, which has basically announced it intends to maintain economic growth at 7 or 8% a year without any further increase in CO2 emissions. I will be pleasantly surprised if they really manage to deliver that, but at least there's the ambition and some substantial follow-through. Along with that, though, we have become so conditioned to thinking of fossil fuels as a valuable resource, notwithstanding resource curse, but some of the trends I'll show you, I think, do raise valid questions about what actually is the valuable energy resource that countries have. I think along with that, we will also need to see some consideration about the greening of international trade and investment. I've suggested a risk-based shift from established relationships to emerging industries. There, what I really have in mind is the financial sector, where it's so comfortable investing in fossil fuels because that's what they've done for the last century. They know it, they know the companies, they've got the relationships, but it's looking increasingly risky the moment you consider environment seriously. And there are a lot of new options which actually are more capital intensive, but very secure and cheap to run. So, you have a structural shift about what is sensible finance in this kind of world. And I think that will include the whole Belt and Road Initiative. Are changes in the Paris Agreement even conceivable? Well, I think I can kind of start to conceive them, but that's not much use. What I want to move on to is what has been the experience from some other countries that have been claiming to sort of lead or try and lead in these transitions. So this really brings me on to the core of what I wanted to communicate, which is admittedly quite a European perspective. I will weave into it some theoretical thoughts from the book that I mentioned. EU energy policy has broadly been characterized by emphasis on market economics, liberalization of the energy sector, leading and culminating, as at least was seen the culmination, with the internal European-wide free trading energy market in not only oil, but electrons and molecules as well. Regional integration of infrastructure is required, and when it came to climate policy, we had a 3 targets approach. There was agreement on what became known as the 2020-2020-20 package. The 20s then referring to 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 20% renewable energy, 20% improvement in energy efficiency, plus an interconnectors target. And all of that to show the complexity, in theory, while still saying that member states had sovereignty over their energy mix. You can kind of see the inherent tensions and close to contradictions. One point is that approach, that 3 targets approach, actually had quite a major sort of ideological battle against classical theory. So it's here I take the detour, because it's broadly based on a worldview which says, well, we believe in markets, we establish markets, we have the well-established theory, which is economic optimization based on relative prices. The clap for those economists will fully recognize, most others. There are certain assumptions buried in that whole structure about representative agents, rational expectations, stable preferences, technology trends, etc. Then you have all of the neoclassical toolkit. All very nice. One interesting feature is normally we think of that as a structure which helps to enhance competition and new entrants. Actually, in the energy sector, just as often it seems to be a structure which supports dominance by incumbent interests that just become private rather than public interests. And of course, the dominant incumbent infrastructures, all of the networks, and the dominant mindsets. And so a lot of people in Europe said, well, why the hell do we have these other targets? If greenhouse gases is the problem, all we need to do is set a greenhouse gas target and have a carbon price, and that should be the solution. Well, I a while ago came to the view that the idea that that was the solution was now part of the problem. Because actually, when you look more closely, a lot of the opportunities, particularly for energy efficiency, reside in what economists have sort of called satisficing, a very clumsy word, but basically that most people, most of the time, don't actually sit down. How many people woke up this morning and thought they were going to optimize their energy use? Right? I don't see many hands going up. None of us do. We don't work that way. Broadly, we are creatures of habit. We're kind of averse to new risks. We don't all the stuff that is now much better understood in terms of behavioural and organisational economics. And it does include organisational principal agent failures, lots of other things. And you do see consistently the engineers saying, but there's loads of ways we could improve energy efficiency. And the economists saying, nah, it can't be true. If people could save money, they would, wouldn't they? And the answer is no, they wouldn't, because they don't. Very often faced with these kinds of things. But there is a clear potential for improved efficiency, and along with it, potentially improved service delivery and lower bills. At the other end, also, there is what I call the third economic domain, which is when actually you start to think the whole structure might change. The technologies can improve, the structures of economics, the institutions, even the behavioural assumptions can change. Typically from, yes, technological innovation, scale economies, new infrastructure, whole new supply chain developments, and potentially social awareness as well. Again, you have some fairly well-developed theories around this, evolutionary and institutional economics. It's just had a very uneasy relationship with the sort of neoclassical variety. But it's in there that you start to get the old, you have to go back to economic theory before the war, to Schumpeter and technology waves as the drivers of major innovation and so forth. Now, the only theoretical point I would add in this is that I've never been very interested in the ideological warfare between these different camps, because to me it's basically describing different processes that occur at different scales, different time scales. You're starting with actually quite small individual decision units, and on the last of those you're looking at broadly global transformations, long-term transformations, and simply the social scale tends to increase. So all of those are true, but at different parts and scales of the system. Now, as I said, the EU approach was slightly battling against the orthodoxy, and quite a lot of people said the approach was madness, including, I have to say, the British government and the OECD. And when you actually step back and look at that wider theory about a broadened view of economics, you start to look at something much more like this, which is, well, yeah, I mean, where you're dealing with the agents and the scales that are rationally calculating, then a carbon price and markets is going to be really important. It's the highest relevant instrument because it will drive people to cleaner products and processes. Where, however, you are dealing with this vast arena of energy efficiency and satisfying behaviour, actually, frankly, yeah, if you doubled energy prices, people might sit up and take notice, but almost certainly they vote you out of office instead. Right? So actually what's worked are efficiency standards and other strategies for engagement that broadly lead to smarter choices. And if what you are trying to do is transform the system, then you have to get involved in strategic investment. Effectively, any investment which is going to lead a bigger public return than any private actor could command. So of course the market is going to under-deliver or fail completely. So you have to have governments involved in shaping the strategic investments in directions that, particularly when you're faced with global challenges, you want the system to evolve in. And that broadly is around innovation and infrastructure. So that was a sort of theoretical detour. It is quite interesting that actually in practice, the major European countries have all been doing all three of those things, however much, and sometimes they protested otherwise in theory. But the UK has broadly had more emphasis upon trying to seek cost-effective and quasi-market approaches to delivering energy efficiency, whereas Germany has actually had a bit more strategic emphasis when they've done efficiency. It's been more standards driven for deep retrofits of buildings rather than the cheapest up front, and much more emphasis upon fundamental innovation in energy supplies. How has that played out in practice? Well, the UK used to be called an island of coal in a sea of oil and gas. Bit of a strange place to try and push low carbon economy, but actually you see the black in the power sector, 80% of generation. Big miners' strike isn't just environment, it was also about political control, and the government introduced privatisation and then used it deliberately to drive gas into the system, to break the power of the mining unions, as well as to try and clean up the system significantly. And then more recently you see energy demand, electricity demand has been coming down because of the energy efficiency programs to an important degree, and recent more rapid growth of renewable energy. Now, I thought it might be useful to just say a few words about the policy. I don't have time to go into detail, but about the both policy and regulatory remit. The first liberalisation was towards what's now become a classic model of an electricity pool. Everybody would, sell into the power pool. You'd have a marginal price in the pool that was very transparent. There'd be a small capacity payment. The dash for gas was based on long-term contracts, power purchasing. We actually saw a collapse of the R&D. The job of the regulator was simple: promote competition. That was its job officially. There were growing concerns about oligopolistic power in the markets. The government moved on to a bilateral, deleted the pool for the electricity geeks here, and moved to a bilateral trading market. Originally NITA, national, and then better when it went full British. A lot of economists actually still question whether that really was better. To be honest, I think it's still a very live dispute. There are a lot of problems that emerged under the bilateral trading market. It led directly to major vertical integration and a collapse of investment. The job of Ofgem, the regulator, was subtly changed to say, well, competition actually should be a means, not an end. The end is to protect consumers, which in regulatory speak meant keep prices as low as possible. Well, that became a problem in the sense that the government was by then trying to decarbonise the system and push renewables, and the regulator was saying, but that's going to drive up costs to consumers. We don't want to do it. Why should we prioritise renewable connection to the grid? And a lot of tension, if you like, more exposed when the UK adopted the Climate Change Act 10 years ago, which basically put in primary legislation the goal of an 80% emission reductions by mid-century. And out of that process led another round of fundamental energy market reform. I don't have time to go into the details, but another thing it did, broadly it set up, at least for renewables, a structure of competitive auctions in long-term contracts with a capacity market. And subtly, out of the political debate over the regulator getting in the way of the transition the government was trying to drive, a genius in the government thought up just explaining that what consumers meant was present and future, leaving the regulator with the question of what the hell does it mean to protect future consumers, which is why they then set up a division of sustainable development and kind of hired people like me to try and help them figure it out. But it has led a process of continual evolution of the regulatory and policy landscape. Where has that led? Well, what I put up here is UK coal burn. It's an annual cycle. We consume more in every winter. Here was the introduction of the European carbon price, which was deeply unstable, as many of you may know. The energy market reform legislation, one of its other planks was to introduce a minimum price of carbon in the power sector, and that's the red top-up. Along with that, you can see a complete collapse of coal generation. UK power sector emissions have halved since 1990. Coal is now below 10% of generation from 80% only 25 years ago. But whilst to some extent this is a story, confirming pricing really matters, I think it's important to acknowledge that where it's really had the impact is on operational choices between coal and gas plants in particular, We basically flipped the merit order. And the other factors was the improved efficiency and the rise of renewables squeezed the space left, so that once you flipped the merit order, there was just nowhere left for coal to go. The UK government will now phase out coal completely by 2025. The French government has announced by 2022, though their coal fleet's much smaller anyway. But it's a pretty dramatic change in the system. And I was a little bit startled when I saw the stat. I confess I haven't actually been back to check it, which I really should do, but I imagine it is true, that UK emissions are now lower than they were a century ago. So, if I come on to Germany briefly, you will see I have a strange habit, which is most people put up quotes to support their case. I put up quotes that I violently disagree with. But here are choice three from barely 4 or 5 years ago, saying these Germans have gone completely crazy. What are they doing? They are doing the most expensive thing imaginable with no purpose in terms of driving the Energiewende, basically the decision to phase out coal and nuclear and replace by renewables, which were supposed to be incredibly expensive. Well, the last one, solar power in Germany, makes as much sense as growing pineapples in Alaska. That was, I should perhaps add, from the CEO of RWE Utility, a utility whose share price has been rather embarrassing, to say the least. It's more or less gone bankrupt. And broadly because they just didn't understand what was happening in the European market and in the renewables industry, where you've had this phenomenal collapse in the costs of solar by roughly a factor of 10 cost reduction in less than 10 years. Just think about that. In the energy sector, I mean, yeah, we know it happens in IT, but it doesn't happen in energy. What's going on? Well, just at the top, I've basically trying to underline innovation is not just about R&D. R&D is the really easy bit. The tough bit is building up entire new industries and supply chains and scales and deliveries, etc., etc., etc. What we have now seen as it's rolled out and indeed gone into sunnier regions is contracted prices, which suggests that solar PV is now probably the world's cheapest energy source in increasing areas. It's certainly cheaper than most existing coal plants in Europe and a number of other regions, including Australia. So, and US, you see this fascinating phenomena of conservative governments in some of these areas actually now desperately trying to subsidize coal plants because otherwise market forces would close them down. Batteries, similarly, have come down for multiple reasons, obviously not at all just energy policy, but integration. And my own take on this is actually they wasn't growing solar pineapples in Alaska at all. It was planting it in a country which had the industrial capacity and the financial structures and the political determination to drive a new industrial revolution. And that is not easy. Germany needs to do it. And it's not cheap. Germans are paying about 20 billion euros a year for the energy revolution that they have, to a large degree, fostered. Another point, though, is to stress that the different models and the different pillars all have value. Energy efficiency, unquestionably economically and socially beneficial, but the scale of demand reductions has been less than we hoped. Carbon pricing has been problematic. EU ETS was very unstable, but at least it probably did deter coal construction to a large degree, and recent reforms appear to have helped to stabilise it. And innovation in renewables has had a huge impact, far more than expected. There are national differences. The UK, I would say, has had more cost-effective over-delivery of our 2020 target, but maybe with less innovation and deep structural change. Germany has been more costly, but you can see it's better placed in terms of really, if you like, furthering that revolution. But I think overall, I would say there's been mutual learning even within Europe, and it shows, and I think this was touched on briefly yesterday in the context of Indian states, the value of regulatory and policy competition, but broadly within a common framework. Now, so the end point is that notwithstanding all of the sort of economic theoretical criticism, the EU earlier this year finally cemented that its 2030 structure would be more or less the same as its 2020 structure, with some important developments, but with much more ambitious numbers attached. Incidentally, the original package was 40% greenhouse gas and less than 30% renewables and energy efficiency. Both of the latters were increased in ambition through the political process with the European Council, which probably implies that the 40% is actually rather modest if you deliver those others. Wouldn't entirely surprise me if Europe ends up strengthening the 40% in due course, but remains to be seen. And there's more elaborate governance structure, because what's really been realised is this is a strategic transformation issue. Countries have to show some sense of where they are going, consistent with the Paris Agreement. So that was a sort of the deep dive into some of the European experience and related theory. I'll just touch a little bit more on the energy revolution, just quite lightly, but the point is to understand now this is going well beyond the technology revolution. This is now a structural process across multiple levels and multiple sectors. On the left is just an imagery, which, not by accident, I chose from Chinese university, where it's absolute ferment in terms of the electricity revolution at distribution scales, smart metering, smart this, storage, but also at the opposite scale, some potentially huge developments. So the German and Dutch transmission operators now saying, well, if we're serious about this, we should just build a small island in the middle of the North Sea shallow area, Dogger Bank, and use that as the place to roll out the offshore wind industry, because it's a massive European resource. And frankly, those of you in the oil and gas business will know the North Sea province has been a huge energy resource, and there's no reason why it shouldn't continue to be, but predominantly through offshore wind and marine renewables. But kind of Europe's sort of forgotten how to think about that scale. We kind of got used to the Chinese are the only ones who think like that. So it's going to be an interesting debate in Europe. But I think overall it's a precursor to expansion. First of all, on the left, a rapid decarbonisation of the electricity sector, because the analysis of the UK Climate Change Committee is we have to get below 100 grams per kilowatt hour as a precursor to rolling out electricity through the transport system and potentially heat. More complex, more uncertain. But that's looking a lot more feasible, perhaps, than it did a few years ago. I do think there's a case to be made that the Energiewende is Germany's gift to the world. It was not cheap. It has opened up options that simply didn't really exist before. It's not for me to speculate on India's choices, but certainly resources is not one of the major constraints on solar. I understand there was a question yesterday about, well, why all this stuff about solar and wind? The answer is really simple, because that's where the big energy is. They're massive resources. And come back to my earlier comment, I think it's now simply an incumbent assumption that oil and gas are the valuable resources. Well, why not the sun and the wind? They're kind of equally big and equally valuable. It's just a question of strategic choices about which ones the countries want to develop, at least in terms of domestic supplies. I think the other feature is that solar in particular is just more different from anything we've had before. Because of the scale, the modularity, the everything, and particularly combined with the information revolution, it just revolutionizes everything in ways that I think I still struggle to understand, and I think many others do, about just how much could change and how much some of our existing structures simply get in the way. A final theoretical chart just about this issue of innovation, because, apologies, but I still find so many economists simply do not seem to understand innovation, which is kind of paradox. They seem to think it's sort of research and development and deployment. All of the interesting stuff happens in between. All of the interesting stuff is broadly all that has to happen when you take from a new technology and to turn it into a major global business. The demonstration, the commercialization and accumulation of scale, supply chains. Why? because along with the technology journey, you need to change the organizations along the way, the supply chain developments along the way, the customer engagement, the standards applied for all the usual reasons, the financing structures change fundamentally as you go through that process. The regulatory structures have to change as you go through that process. The institutions have to develop, evolve. We all live in societies where lobbies are very important. They need to develop. And the infrastructure has to change. So all of those things have to change in order to conduct the kind of transformation that we have now really seeing most of all in Germany, but rapidly emerging elsewhere. I'm not saying that's a linear process, they don't all go together, but at least it's a kind of little map of where things can get stuck and where one needs to pay some policy attention. So my sort of penultimate slide really is just to say that what I now really see, and I try to capture in this slide, is from a climate standpoint, we kind of had 2 decades of discussion about what is the cost of cutting emissions. And what's now clear to me is, a low carbon world is simply not a higher cost version of a high carbon world. It's just something fundamentally different. Now, you can look at it in terms of these sort of twin valleys that diverge over time. Vertically consider the cost. There is some evidence that suggests the most expensive place is just getting stuck in the middle, where you're kind of half doing fossil fuels and half doing renewables and stuff. Different countries are obviously at different places, both in terms of left, right, and how far down. The US is deeply entrenched in the fossil fuel valley, and it's struggling hard, to get out of it, and you see the tensions. California has basically unilaterally declared it's going to go down this valley. But the fundamental point is that green futures are ones with... We know how to build a relatively low-cost, carbon-intensive future. That's partly what the shale revolution was about. It's about working out, I sometimes quip, how to mess up the atmosphere a lot more cheaply. And we've been quite successful at that. But we've also been successful at opening up the other future, which is much more emphasis on innovation, increased integration across sectors, and so forth. And that is a strategic choice. And I was recalled to a quote from at least 3,000 years ago from Seneca, who said, well, if you don't know where you're going, it's unlikely that any winds are going to be very helpful. So if you like, what we're seeing is the reinvention of industrial strategy in the energy sector, including in the UK, which used to hate the word industrial strategy. It was banned from Whitehall. And now we have a Department of Energy and Industrial Strategy, because the low-carbon economy is seen as one of the foundational elements of UK industrial strategy. So I am now concluding, Ajay. You haven't interrupted me. You're probably not doing your job. But I do, to come back to the starting point. Asia, I think now is the dominant pivot of the global energy system. I don't know what that implies. You would probably know better. But I do see the old relationships on several fronts really beginning to crumble. I do think climate change is a pressing issue, which I'm seriously running out. I think it helps that major OECD countries are now bringing emissions down, though not nearly enough, and still relatively narrowly focused on the electricity sector. But it has at least helped to drive a revolution in what seems possible, which opens up potentially new paths for global economic and development. And I think that does offer a new approach for international, new way of international approaches. Within the framework of the Paris Agreement, for all of the old debates about, broad versus deep, legally binding, not, etc., I think we're seeing something which potentially facilitates more, if you like, regional, not regional necessarily, but if you like, coalition approaches from those who say, well, actually, we want to be in the Green Valley here. That's where we want to go, and we want to work with other countries that are pushing that to try and become the dominant force in the energy geopolitics of the 21st century. But to be honest, I don't think we have really begun to understand the implications. And I do mean we. I don't think I understand the implications fully. I've merely tried to sketch what I see as components. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And you did all of that and took only 5 minutes more than was allocated to you. So thank you very much. It was amazingly interesting. Uh, there are many things that I took away from it, but I think the 3 points that I believe underlie the transitions is one, Germany enabled it. But beyond that, these are economic transitions that are occurring, whether it is coal going to gas in the US or whether it's renewables replacing fossil fuels in many parts of the world. So the speed and scale largely depends on when various economic transitions occur. And this is a question that I would like to open up to the floor. The second is that it is a scale issue. We are talking in terms of what you and I can do today within the context of the current infrastructure. What can be done day after tomorrow by choices that we make about what technologies do we get, whether you get an electric car or not, and the infrastructural choices are made by society which have a longer term to act in. And consequently, action on all the three at the same time is possible, but the period over which they would act would be very different. And I would very much like a discussion on how these scale issues affect the transition. The third issue is, I think, relates to energy efficiency. And the fact that at the end of the day, no matter how much we move to renewables, if we use too much energy, even all the renewables in the world would not be good enough or would be too expensive. Obviously, in countries like India, it leads to a very different question. We face this rather strange issue, still face it, that you have industry here which is amongst the most energy efficient in the world, and you also have industry which continues to be economically viable, which uses 3 to 4 times as much energy to produce a ton of steel or cement or whatever. And it's a huge question, why do they coexist? And I think the answer lies in the fact that in developing countries, there are growing markets. There is a steel industry or a cement industry which is today meeting the demand grows. Now when I put up a new unit that's more capital intensive, and if it needs to be competitive, it has to be more energy intensive. That's the only way that it can compete in the market. So every new plant that is built is typically more efficient than the last one. Again, I think an issue to be resolved. Together with the energy efficiency issue is the larger issue, Michael, that you focused on, which is of, so what happens if the decarbonization of the electricity sector occurs? Would electrification of areas where today we use fossil fuels be the best way forward? Electric vehicles, for example. Great way to start moving away from oil products, but it obviously means that the demand for electricity increases that much more. There are these issues, and there are many more, I'm sure, that we will come up with. But before we move on to Radhika and Navroz, let me ask if there are any questions that you have for Michael. I would like these to be clarificatory questions rather than discussions. We'll keep the discussion to the end. But if there are any clarificatory questions, if I could have a show of hands, that would just allow me to manage the time. Michael, you were amazingly clear. This is absolutely amazing. Well, okay. Absolutely. Else we will plow deep into the Indian context. And then can I request Navroz to share his thoughts?
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much, Ajay. I'm delighted to be here as part of this panel. I think sort of one of the tricks when trying to put together the panel, this, Radhika and I have sort of worked together to put this together, is to invite people who are mentors, whom you've learned a lot from over the years, and whose company you just genuinely enjoy. And all of those things are true of people on this panel. So I'm privileged to be part of this discussion. In an ideal world, I would have taken all Michael's insights and worked them through the language and the thoughts on India. But I'm not going to be able to do that. So I just want to be upfront about this. I think we'll have to rely on Ashok to do that in his discussant remarks. So that's your burden, Ashok. Instead, what I'm going to try and do is actually, in a sense, look at the India story, paint sort of a fairly broad brush picture, but focus a little bit more on the specifics of the kinds of India-specific issues that, in a sense, are exercising a drag on the Indian energy discussion and the Indian energy transformation. So it's a little bit of story about how do we move forward while being very aware of the context within which we are embedded, which I think is actually in many ways the real story for India. So the starting point is, and like Michael, I'm going to resort to a few pretty pictures, and I'll try and walk you through them as carefully as I can. The starting point for much of our work at CPR is that energy really is a multi-dimensional challenge, that we have to look at it through a variety of different lenses, and we learn different things when you look at it through those different lenses. So I'm going to take each of these in turn. I have my squiggly line diagrams, just like Michael, but the first is about really the core issue of providing energy to fuel India's development. And the graph here shows along the y-axis here, it's energy use per capita, and along this axis is GDP per capita, but interestingly, please note that this is a log scale, right? So this is 100,000, 10,000, and 100,000 in US dollars. Now, what you see is that if you take the US, and this is again from 1961 to 2017 over here, you see sort of the increase that Michael described. You see that sort of flattening that they described, and then this sort of squiggle in the last decade as countries begin to start thinking about low carbon and so on and so forth. Focusing on India, what's interesting is sometime over the last 10 to 15 years, India has begun diverging from the least developed countries, right? So we have been sort of in line with least developed countries, but have begun diverging more recently. We are substantially below Brazil and China, the countries whom we often ally with in, say, climate negotiations, the sort of rapidly rising giants that we're compared to. We're considerably below them in per capita terms. And in terms of where we are in our economy, we're well behind, especially, again, remembering this is a log scale, well behind many of these countries, right, which are out here in terms of their GDP per capita. The other thing you notice from this is just how important energy use seems to be in terms of bringing about economic gains. So if you look at China, they had this very large increase in energy that, so from around this level to about this level over the last decade, but look at the enormous gains they've made in terms of their GDP per capita. So really that increase in energy use is what has lifted 1 billion people basically from somewhere around $2 a day to somewhere around $8 a day, right? So basically has propelled them into the global middle class. So energy is a really important part of understanding how GDP occurs, which is not synonymous with development. I think we shouldn't fall into that trap, but it is one of the indicators of certain directions that many people would aspire their country to go towards. So there's high economic returns to increasing energy use. And for India, a particular way in which this question gets articulated is around jobs. We're going through our demographic transition. Will India be able to provide jobs for its population, many of whom are now moving from agriculture to industry, moving from rural economies to urban economies? Can we do it without massively increasing our energy use? Right? No country in history has ever done it without doing that. No country has ever had a services-led economy. Are we going to rapidly increase our energy use in the future? This is sort of the big context for India. What sort of trajectory are we going to follow? Are we going to look like China and pick up like this? Are we going to be relatively flat? how are we going to manage this transition? It's very interesting, of course, that our transition happens right around the time that renewable energy prices have come down as steeply as they have. So it's a real opportunity for India, but it doesn't mean it's one that will be seamlessly taken advantage of, and I'll come back to that later. So this is one big piece of the overarching context. The second one, which is a more standard argument, is old-fashioned energy security, right? Which is, how does a country make sure it has reliable supply of electricity at a reasonable low cost? And in India's case, we worry a lot about limited oil and gas, relatively low-quality coal. And this conversation was particularly salient around 2010, 2012, when oil prices went up very steeply. You don't hear about it quite as much anymore, but it was an obsession in the past, and depending on, again, what happens with technology and so on, continues to be part of the political narrative around energy in India. It's also interesting that in academic literature, as well as in NGO circles, energy security has been broadened now to think not just about how much we produce at home and how much we import, but to think in a more multidimensional way around access, around local environment and so on. And actually, Surya Sethi is here with us, and he used this expanded phrasing when he developed the integrated energy policy back in the mid-2000s, and I think that was a real sort of change in our thinking. I'm deliberately using it in this more narrow way here, but I think it's important that we've expanded. I should also mention that Prayas has a multidimensional energy security index, which uses it in the broader way, and I think that's heartening that we're thinking about security in these more diverse, in its more multivalent ways. The third lens through which I want to put this energy story is the environmental quality. And apologies to those who were here yesterday, some of these slides you saw, but we talk a lot about air quality. I'm focusing on that because it's sort of, the issue du jour. It's winter in Delhi. How do you not talk about it in every presentation? But it's also about water, forests, marine ecosystems, coastal zones, and so on. But just to explain how problematic the air pollution story is, these are sort of our scales based on our Indian air quality index. And as Shibani, who made the presentation yesterday, pointed out, in Delhi in 2018, we have had 1 or 2 days of air quality that is in the good zone in 2018, and about 55% that is above, that is either poor, very poor, or severe, right? So more than half the number of days. And these levels are themselves much higher than what the WHO recommends. The WHO level is actually 10 parts per million, right? So we are now, you can debate where we are in Delhi, but across the whole Indo-Gangetic plain, actually, we are somewhere between 10 and 13 times, or 1,000 to 1,300% above WHO safe standards, right? So we can't think about energy in ways that don't take air quality into account, but also increasingly issues around water, forests, mines, marine ecosystems, and so on. The fourth story, and I deliberately sort of put this forth because I think in India, as in many other countries, the domestic considerations are always going to trump the politics. Development, security, environmental quality, and so on. But nor can we ignore the climate context that we live in. That we are living in a warming world. India is a deeply vulnerable country, and we now have international obligations. So, what does that look like from an Indian perspective? Well, this is a very it's a complicated graph. I hesitate to put it up, but many who work on this are deeply attached to it because we spent a long time doing it, and we went through many iterations. So I'm going to make you suffer through it as well. Along this axis is actually the 2030 carbon dioxide emissions of India. Okay, and it starts at around 2 gigatons, which coincidentally is what India was in around 2012, right? And it goes up to about 5.5 gigatons. Along this axis is different GDP growth rates until 2030, average growth rates till 2030. Now this dartboard of dots here are different studies done by different organizations. And as you can see, they really range enormously. So according to one study, we are barely going to increase from our 2012 levels by 2030. According to another study, we're actually going to almost triple our emissions by 2030. That's a pretty big range, right? Now, what we tried to do was to sort of unpack this a little bit, and these color codes are basically different sorts of families of studies. So up here are studies that used a lower, that were done soon after 2012, right? Before the latest wave of policies had been put in place, the renewable energy targets, the energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. So naturally, they projected higher levels. Then you have a cluster in here that are more recent and that also look at additional policies. And they're in the middle here, and then you have some that are sort of more explicitly low carbon policies that understandably come up with lower numbers. These tram lines here are India's Paris pledge, which is 33 to 35% below 2005 levels of India's emissions intensity by 2030. Now, I'm not going to go into whether, so basically the bottom line is that a lot of the projections suggest that we are more or less on track for Paris. But the point I want to make in putting this slide up is that there are enormous uncertainties in where India's emissions future are going to come out. And those uncertainties are probably because there are enormous uncertainties in our energy future, right? So there are some big choices that India has to make. And by contrast, the EU, in some ways, the uncertainties are even greater because we haven't locked into a lot of those choices. If India is going to dramatically increase its energy needs, as most people expect that we will, whether we do it on a coal-based, through a coal-based route or a renewable-based route will have massive implications for where we end up. Radhika is going to talk next more about the demand side, and that's a huge source of uncertainty. How do we build our cities? What do our transport networks look like? Are they based on private cars? Are they based on public transport? What do our freight corridors look like? These are all things that are yet to really be determined. And that's another reason why we have so much uncertainty. So the point I want to make is our energy future is actually tied to our vision of our development future. What does our urbanization look like? Do we have a manufacturing versus services-led growth? Do we lock in to energy-efficient infrastructure, or do we lock into inefficient infrastructure and lock out energy efficiency? So there's a set of development choices, and that's one reason why these models struggle so much, because they all make different assumptions, and there's a very wide range of assumptions that one can make. So these questions about development choices are really closely tied to our energy futures, and I think that is one reason why it's important to be explicit and think through what those choices mean for India going forward. So now, how does one think through this? The typical way is to, it's energy type wonks. We basically try and break this down into subsectors, right? And often these are challenging and important and difficult questions. And the kinds of questions we ask are, how can we deepen and broaden energy access solutions? Something that is really critical because still a vast number of Indians do not have access to commercial energy. Despite our rolling out the grid, electricity doesn't frequently flow through those wires. A lot of people still use biomass for cooking and so on and so forth. So that remains a very, very important policy challenge. How fast can we expand renewable energy and manage grid integration challenges? A lot of our colleagues in the NGO and research world are thinking about this question very actively. What quantum of coal does India need? Which is of course, the answer to that is tied to the second question in the future. What is the role for expansion of gas? So a lot of these questions are based around particular fuels. Or there's a question around the demand side, which is something, again, Radhika will look at. What is the potential for integration of transport and electricity systems? Now, these are the questions we're all thinking about. You'll be relieved to hear that I'm not going to try and answer them. I wouldn't do a very good job, and I would incur Ajay's wrath. So I'm going to go a different route, which is to say a lot of these questions actually turn on questions around how India thinks about and governs its energy sector. So I just want to actually move into a brief discussion around some of these energy governance challenges, and then I'll hand over to Radhika. So I'm just going to make 3 points to caricature what is quite a complicated set of questions. The first is this. Too often, we think about energy policy through just one lens, right? So it's just about energy access, or it's just about energy security. And actually, as I've tried to show, all of our energy challenges actually often have implicitly multiple objectives. And I think our policy making would be improved if we were explicit about that multiple objective framework. So most policy choices require understanding the trade-offs and synergies across these multiple objectives, and we at CPR have written a few papers trying to lay out methodologies through which policymakers could do this. So you have to have a process of identifying the objectives, analytically exploring trade-offs and synergies, and then very importantly, because you have those trade-offs and synergies, there are different winners and losers from your policy choices. So you have to have some sort of political deliberative process to engage those winners and losers if that policy is going to have much success at implementation. Let me give you an example. When we designed the National Solar Mission, there wasn't actually, which has actually been very successful at encouraging uptake, there wasn't much discussion, is my understanding, and again, maybe Surya can correct me in the question and answer, because I think he was there, as perhaps Ajay was in the conversation. Implicitly, the assumption was what we want to do is rapid uptake of solar power, right? But there were certainly voices that said, why aren't we using solar, less complex technologies, for example, solar water heaters and so on and so forth, to provide services in rural areas? It was a completely different direction the solar mission could have taken. Yet another direction was to think about manufacturing, right? Do we want to, and in fact, part of the confusion with the solar mission, eventually we got taken to the WTO and so on and so forth, was there was a sort of belated effort to tack on a Make in India component to the solar mission. So that confusion, and then finally, was the objective low-cost electricity? At the time, solar was running at around, 15, 12 rupees a unit, right? So it was obviously not compatible at the time with low-cost electricity, but there was always a conversation, well, what does that mean for providing low-cost electricity? How do we force distribution companies to buy more solar and so on and so forth? And having a more explicit multiple objective discussion around the solar mission would perhaps have led to some clarity. The reason I think that explicit discussion is important because the trade-offs are not just technical. As I said earlier, they're political trade-offs. The choices you make benefit different groups differently. And it's also important to think through the implementation challenges. So let me give you an example of the sort of thought process one can go through. This is something that actually we worked on with Ashok a while ago. Radhika, Ashok, and myself wrote this paper in EPW, and we said, well, let's think through the cooking fuel issue, right? What are the economic costs you're thinking about minimizing? What are the environmental impacts you want to gain? What are the social costs? And very importantly, what are the institutional hurdles? And for each of those, we broke them down into a set of metrics, into a set of criteria, and a set of objectives, and then a set of criteria. So just to take the example of the social costs, right? So one of them is minimizing drudgery, in particular the costs on rural women of collecting fuel, wood, and so on and so forth, minimizing recurrent expenditure, minimizing upfront expenditure. And these are the kinds of things that actually have been the conversations around the program to expand access to gas for cooking in rural areas. A lot of the issues have actually ended up being around some of these institutional hurdles. So the argument is that actually thinking through the logic of how you implement things as well as what the different objectives you're trying to achieve are something that we should make a matter of course, whether it's at the level of cooking fuels or something as strategic as a renewable energy program. The second suggestion, and this is sort of picking up something I have to confess, when I was listening to Pratap talk in the session yesterday, a couple of light bulbs go up, as they often do when you're listening to Pratap. A lot of what we do is we focus on schemes, right? So you have sort of a mission mode, 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, or an LED program, and in some cases it's entirely suitable, like for example the LED program, which Ajay was a champion of. But in other cases, we have to think about, if you're thinking about a complex transition, and I liked very much Michael's framework from his Planetary Economics book, you have to think about all the bits and pieces that go into making that transition possible, right? So one of the things that India is grappling with is this transition to renewable electricity. Now, we're all celebrating the fact that, courtesy of the Germans, the cost of renewable energy has come down below the operating cost of coal, and that is a cause for celebration. But does that mean that we will automatically now switch to coal? And the answer is no. It depends on a number of things happening. And I just thought I would kind of walk you through, and this is just, a short list. It's not by any means the full list. But one of the obvious things that people talk about is grid integration, the fact that the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, you have intermittency issues. How do you then keep the lights on all the time? And we do talk about, this is the conversation that's most closely linked with this adoption of RE story. And often the discussion focuses on storage costs. And in fact, if storage costs come down, this problem would substantially be solved. But in the interim, as well as, in the interim, but also if we're going to have more thoroughgoing integration of RE, there are a number of other issues that are tied to this. For example, we've been sort of groping towards electricity markets in India, and we keep sort of changing our structures and so on and so forth. If we are going to have ways of fully realizing renewable energy potential, we have to broaden the scale of electricity markets, for which we need to have well-developed transmission networks, and we need to have the market institutions to govern that trade. That's, again, something that often gets talked about. But then when you dig even deeper, if you look at the distribution companies, at the moment, distribution companies are run in ways that actually don't incentivize them to search for low-cost power. And that has to do with the internal incentive structures of employees in distribution companies, right? It has to do with both their knowledge networks as well as what they're incentivized to do. So you've got to think about the inner workings of discoms if you're going to take care of this problem. There's also an opportunity to use demand responsiveness to smoothen out your electricity demand and thereby meet the challenges of integration. So there's a set of issues around integration. But then there's also a set of issues around locking into existing coal contracts. And there's really a tussle going on right now at the political level, which says, do we lock into coal because we're really worried about keeping the lights on, even at the expense of locking out renewables? Or do we sort of go down the what may be perceived as a slightly more risky path of thinking we can integrate renewables and build up the renewable system fast enough that we don't have to rely on coal? And that's clearly not just a technical discussion. It's not a bunch of technocrats sitting around, deciding what the probabilities are. There are very, very strong interests at play. The interests stretch from the banking sector, which has financed a lot of coal-fired power plants, and those loans account for a lot of the sad state of the Indian public sector banks. It also speaks to the political economy of coal-rich states. If coal demand goes down, what happens to jobs and not just labor, but the families, the communities that depend on those jobs? Are we going to sort of extend the horizon of coal because we're worried about a disruptive transition in coal-rich states? There's also economics of railways tied to this. At the moment, coal freight is one of the ways in which passenger rail in India is subsidized, which is politically really important. So there's a set of those linkages. There's also local environmental factors, most of which come out on the side of spurring an accelerated transition. So you have local effects of mining. We have the air quality story we talked about. We talked about the dependence of coal on water use. And then there are also environmental problems on the renewable side in terms of land and access to rare earths and so on and so forth. So I think we need to start thinking about these energy challenges in multi-causal ways. And our governance system is often tied to sort of stroke of the pen administrative actions, which may not actually lend themselves to thinking through these linkages. And I think it's incumbent on us to sort of put these issues as forcefully as we can in front of decision makers. So coming to the last point, I think we also have a situation of, in many countries, energy politics is entrenched. We've had several references to the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, and Marie-Hélène smiles broadly when I mentioned that. This is not unique to India by any means, but we also have a sort of a, if not unique, then at least a very particular characteristic of the Indian state. And Lant Pritchard has this nice term, instead of a failing state, he calls India a flailing state. And I think it's in many ways quite apt. So when you talk about energy politics, you have a sort of addiction to fuel subsidies, electricity subsidies. It's an instrument of often of vote bank politics. And to be perfectly candid about it, the energy system is also tied to the whole election finance machinery in complicated ways, as is the construction industry and so on. We have questions around gaming of contracts. We have this battle that Prayas is leading in terms of the power purchase agreement for some very big coal-fired power plants that went all the way up to the Supreme Court and has just sort of roared back into life. So there's issues around the sanctity of those contracts. So these are all sort of so energy is very deeply enmeshed in our political economy, and on the state side, we're still dealing with some fairly basic bread and butter issues. We have questions around the credibility of data and how well accessible that is. Within government, we really don't have the analytical capacity that we should have, nor do we have the linkages that are well established with external actors in ways that are structured that allows us to have those kinds of conversations. We do have an administrative machinery for departments to talk to each other, but again, that tends to, the default is to fall back into silos or to have extremely high level, committees of secretaries where you don't necessarily have the kind of robust back and forth. It's often very hierarchical. Everybody knows which ministry is top dog and which comes next and so on and so forth until you get to environment at the bottom, typically. So these are all sort of challenges. And finally, we've injected this idea of regulators. We had a discussion in the air session yesterday about regulators as well, as providing some kind of buffer, some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card to deal with the politics of the sector. And in a previous existence, I've studied electricity regulators, and the sad news is that I think regulators play a very important role, but it is unfair to assume that they can actually skillfully mediate technical and neatly separate technical and political aspects of decision making. So we haven't really sorted out our decision making structure in India. We tried to sort of take on these issues in a recent book so this is part content, part advertisement, but there you go. It's called Mapping Power, and what we tried to do is look at the electricity distribution sector, which is driven by persistent pathologies. For 20, 25 years, you have these loss-making sectors. As a result of them being loss-making, they don't invest typically in improving quality of service. You then have dissatisfied customers who refuse to pay higher prices. You have situations where to make the numbers add up, you end up increasing the tariffs on the paying customers you do have, which tend to be industry. They get irritated, they leave the grid, and you continue in this sort of merry dance. And we've been doing this for 20 odd years. And so what we asked is, instead of thinking about electricity as a technical issue with some political irritations, let's put the politics at the heart of it. What are the politics around the electricity sector? And we basically said, if you look at the demands for access and subsidies, that's sort of the core political demand that people make on the sector. And the ability of a state to meet those demands depends on a few key things, like the electricity supply costs and basically how rich the state is. And the balance between those two things determines how much space you have to work your way out of an entrenched electricity politics. And so we looked at these 15 states and said, which states have worked themselves out, and which states have got stuck, and which states are really going nowhere. Using a line from Anna Karenina, we basically said that each state is unhappy in its own way, because the variety of ways in which states seems to get themselves stuck are very disparate. But what's important is there isn't a single state story. They're very historically contingent, often shaped by geography, shaped by the larger politics of a state. And maybe I'll just take a minute, if I may, Ajay, to give you one example. Let me give you a positive example to begin with. The state of Bihar, which is, as many of you know, is extremely poor, extremely low access. What Bihar did, and it's a little bit of a puzzle, right? You think that actually providing electricity to your population is a great political move, right? It would be rewarded by success at the ballot box. But surprisingly, you have a number of states where they haven't made an effort to do that. Orissa has been stuck in low access situation. West Bengal has been stuck. Bihar has been stuck. And so Orissa, for example, actually exports power. They've made a whole industrial strategy of exporting power, but not providing it to their own population. So what's going on there? Why is this the case? So what Bihar did was quite interesting. There's sort of a history I won't get into about sort of Bihar politics, but most recently, Nitish Kumar, and partly because, well, let me step back. During the Lalu Prasad Yadav era, one could argue that the mobilization of lower castes led to sort of a demand for various public services, including electricity. But they were not able to deliver on that demand. And then Nitish Kumar, when he came in, was able to actually quite skillfully do a couple of things. He made it explicitly an element of his political agenda, but also because all the surrounding states had surplus power, which they weren't able to sell, he was able to buy relatively low-cost power and did not lock the state into high-cost power purchase agreements, right? And so on that basis, Bihar has actually electrified extremely rapidly. So that's sort of a Bihar-specific story. We have similar stories around Maharashtra and Gujarat and so on and so forth. I'm happy to talk to anybody afterwards about this. But the point that we want to make is the way out of these pathologies is a state-specific pathway that takes into account the politics of the state, takes into account the broader technology in the sector, and takes into account some of the national framework around electricity, such as the Electricity Act and so on and so forth. Last point I'll make on this is that renewable energy plays a very interesting role here. It's a potential disruptor of all the things I've just talked about. To give two examples of two opposite ways in which this could go. You could have a story where renewable energy is used to provide low-cost power to rural areas, to farmers, and so on and so forth. And what that would do is take a lot of your subsidy-seeking population off the system, right? So it releases the financial stress on the sector. That would be happy if that happened. Alternatively, what could happen is industry, who's really upset about high-cost power, about having to bear the burden of cross-subsidies, could say, we're done, we're all going to invest in captive renewable energy, go off the system, and basically then undercut the finances of the sector because all your wealthy paying customers leave. And that would sort of cause an implosion of the distribution companies. Or both could happen. So the point is, we need to understand not just the potential of technology to disrupt, but how that gets mediated by the politics. And that's going to be actually a state-by-state story. So let me just sort of quickly wrap up by just highlighting a few of the points that I think would be great to take forward in conversation. I'm looking forward to how Ashok brings all this together when he talks about the global context and the Indian context. We have to keep that context in mind. I would argue that we do have to explicitly engage the multiple objectives instead of accidentally sort of bringing them in now and then. We have to remember that these debates are embedded in multiple social and political contexts in India and think about, therefore, a multi-causal strand of analysis, making the links to the banking sector, making the links to political demands for energy access, making the links to changes in the water sector, and so on. And finally, this point that we do have this inheritance of a series of governance challenges, of an entrenched politics in a flailing state, and we would be foolish to ignore those factors as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Navroz. The emphasis on bringing politics in the center of the energy transition, particularly the electricity sector transition, is, I think, an extremely welcome discussion. It's something that is either talked of on the sidelines or is ignored. But I'm, Navroz, very glad that you brought it center stage, along with the larger issue of growth of the electricity sector and the need for the electricity sector growth. We now move to Radhika, who I think would be focusing more on the demand side. Radhika, all yours.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here and be with all of you. I'm going to focus on the other side of, or the other half of the energy system, which is really asking the question, what do we need all this energy from renewables, from coal, all this discussion we've been having so far? What do we need this energy for? How much do we need? And by whom is this energy being demanded? And how is this demand changing as India transitions? So it's a part of Okay, it is working. So this sort of emphasis on looking at questions of demand has been systematically ignored in the literature for a long time, but there is now a growing evidence that thinking about energy demand solutions is actually crucial, not just to climate change mitigation, but to sustainable development goals more broadly. And the IPCC's 1.5 report makes a really strong claim about this, because what the report says is there are only two ways to achieve the temperature goal that is laid out in that report. One is through negative emission technologies, and these are technologies that have not yet been developed to scale. And the only other way to do this is by reducing energy demand, which is something that is much more in our hands and something we could really move towards. Now, this issue is even more salient for us here in India because we are going to be in the midst of the largest urban transition in global history. The next biggest urban transition is going to unfold here, is already unfolding. This is both a demographic transition with a doubling of the urban population between about 2015 and 2030. It's also an infrastructure transition with 2/3 of the buildings that will exist in 2030 to be largely built between 2010 and 2030. And the real question that gives rise to is how do we negotiate this tension between growing energy consumption for development, something we need very crucially, but doing this in a way where we protect the global and the local environment. Now, I'm going to argue that these transitions actually provide us with an opportunity to reconcile this tension between consumption and protecting the environment. And the way that they do that is that transitions offer us a moment to shape infrastructures, right? Now, these infrastructures from the energy demand side are for buildings, for our transportation systems, for food and commodities. But these infrastructures, importantly, are some of the longest lasting components of the economy. So the road networks of road buildings, these last for about half a century. What we build now will stay for the next 50 years, if not longer. And these infrastructures shape the solution space, right? So I'm much more likely to be able to use public transportation if my house is built within walking distance from a metro station. So shaping the solution space is really a function of infrastructures, and we're at a moment where we are building out those infrastructures. So you have here, and I'm not sure how clearly you can see it in this diagram, is the solution space, and it lays out that shaping solution spaces and locking in particular energy consumption patterns is a function of many different things. It's a function of our lifestyles, it's a function of policies around efficiency and urban policies, and it's a function of the urban form that is built. And this sort of speaks to Michael's point of different scales that are at play. We're at a moment now where all of these three different scales are at play, and these are at play in different sectors. So again, I'm not sure if you can see it, but this is the waste sector, the transportation sector, and the building sector. And each of these are now in moments of flux in their lifestyle, in the way that we're engaging with them through our lifestyles, through our policies, and through urban form. And they provide us with opportunities to shape a very different consumption pattern than we could have had. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this presentation is focus on the buildings component and use that as a way to give a flavor of the transitions that are under play, but also the opportunities that arise from these transitions. Sorry. Okay, so within buildings, one of the most important questions for us is how is consumption of household energy services changing as we urbanize? Now, residential energy consumption is the fastest growing component of the Indian economy in terms of energy, that 85% of the floor space in 2050 will be residential. We're going to build 12 million new homes in the next few years. And homes already use a quarter of India's energy consumption. So again, all of that coal and renewable that we're focusing on, where is that headed? What is that for? And it's really the housing sector, which is a large component of where this will end up. And the projections are that it's going to grow 5 to 6 times between now and 2030. But if we really go into the studies and sort of see how much are we actually going to need, this is a graph that Prayas produced, and you can see here for 2032, These are different studies that range from the electric power surveys in the states to IEA projections. There's actually a wide range. The truth is that we have very limited understanding of what we know about how we use energy in the residential sector and how it will grow out. And not knowing that is a really significant barrier to estimating demand, but also planning for supply. How much should we plan if we don't know how much we're actually going to be using? Let's focus on what we do know. And on this, I just want to contextualize residential electricity use here with how it's used in other parts of the world. And you can see that on an annual per capita residential electricity use basis, the US is an order of magnitude higher than China and India, potentially not a surprise. China is about 3 times, the Chinese average is about 3 times the Indian average. So a household in China or a person in an electrified household in China is using about 3 times what they use in India. What's really interesting here is actually the difference between Delhi and India is more than the difference between India and China. So that means that a person in a household in Delhi is using more or more than 3 times the amount that the average person in India is using in an electrified household. And why that's important is that as we go through these development transitions, Delhi is actually setting the bar in many ways where the rest of the country is headed. So again, understanding that transition and seeing the ways in which we can shape that and sort of thinking through those ways really offers us a way to meet not just our sort of climate temperature targets, but our sustainable development goals more broadly. So what's going on in Delhi? These are graphs where we took IHDS data. So this is national level data. The different lines are the different states. And the x-axis is just the households ranked according to an asset index. So the further you move along the x-axis, the households have more assets. So these are sort of proxies for wealth in some sense. And the y-axis is the probability of owning an appliance. And here we're just looking at 2 energy-intensive appliances, washing machines and fridges. And what stands out in these graphs is that Delhi, again, is doing something very different to all the other states compared to what the ownership of appliances look like. So washing machines are actually the penetration of washing machines is much higher in Delhi than it is in any of the other states. But again, the direction of travel is such that these states are going to soon be mirroring what's happening in Delhi. And similarly for a fridge. So the average person in Delhi owns a fridge much earlier on than they do in the other states. Again, pointing to the need to really understand how these transitions are different in the different states, taking on Navroz's point that understanding the political economy, not just from the supply side, but also from the demand side, is important if we want to shape different consumption patterns. So we took a deeper dive into the National Capital Region, and this is based on a survey that we were part of, where we looked at 5,500 households in the NCR, just to see what is the sequence in which households actually pursue appliances. And the reason why the sequence is important is it tells us from a policy-making point of view where we can think about points of intervention and what are the appliances we can focus on, because these appliances are being bought for the first time. Often when they're bought, they stay in the system, they get passed on secondhand, and the transition offers us a moment to do things differently. So what we see here is the top line is the TV, and almost, sort of even the lowest ranked households on the asset index have a TV. Again, the fridge kicks in very early on, right? So the fridge and the TV are almost ubiquitous within these 5,500 representative samples for the Delhi region. And then sort of halfway down the line, we see the washing machine and the water purifier kick in. So these are really, in terms of our energy-intensive appliances, what we're pursuing as a society, as a city. And we have to think about what the energy implications of that are. Are the goods that we're using energy efficient? Is the policy-making framework around these such that we're pushing for energy efficiency in these appliances? And right now, that isn't fully the case. Now that's Delhi, but what's happening in poor parts, right? So here are some ladders, as I call them, the energy service ladders or appliance ladders for low income homes. And this is taken from a study that we did in Rajkot where we said, okay, we know that Delhi has water purifiers and washing machines and fridges and televisions. What's happening in lower income homes? So if you focus on this graph at the bottom, again, this is our asset index. So we see that the fan sort of kicks in pretty early, but the TV, which is this line, actually kicks in sort of halfway down the sample. And what's interesting about this is that the TV and the fridge price point is not that different. This is a very hot climate, but the TV, even in these low-income homes at the peripheries of Rajkot, where this data is from, is in there. And this is sort of, it corroborates the larger sociological literature that says that TV viewing has become one of the most important entertainment and information related activities across the country. And so this is where, as a society, this is what our energy services are being pursued for. And then the fridge kicks in much later. So it's really only the sort of wealthier parts of these low income homes that have the fridge, vis-a-vis Delhi, where the fridge is sort of, even when you're quite or lower ranked in the asset index, you do have a fridge. I want to take you now to sort of this graph on top, and this is lighting focused. What's interesting here is that so these two lines are incandescent and CFL bulbs, and we see that these are relatively flat. Even as you get wealthier, you're not really buying more incandescent bulbs or CFL bulbs, but what you are doing, and you're starting this pretty early, is that even lower ranked households in the low income group are are owning LED lights. And this speaks to the sort of success of the LED program and the Ujala program that really focused on the fact it sort of the intersection of energy efficiency policies with the urban transition that is taking place, where people are buying appliances for the first time, and they can be offered schemes and information that allows for a transition where these sort of lighting devices are now going to stay in the system for many years to come, and that even low-income homes are buying energy efficient LED bulbs, which are more expensive. What was interesting about all of this is that air conditioners didn't really show up, and we know that the future of cooling is one of the most significant questions that is ahead of us as India transitions, but also because the cooling demand from India is projected by the IEA to be amongst the highest, if not the highest in the world. So it's worth looking at what really is going on with air conditioners. On the left-hand side is again looking at states from around India, the IHDS data, and we see that for air conditioners, Delhi stands out, but it's really the highest end of these households that are, really the wealthiest ones that have air conditioners. And so what we did is we looked more deeply at what's going on in Delhi in our own survey of 5,500 households. This line up here is fans. So you can see that even the sort of households that are lowest ranked all have fans. This line is air coolers. And what this tells us is that actually the primary cooling service for the NCR region, which is the highest consuming region in the country, for cooling, we're still really reliant on air coolers, and air conditioners, which is this line here, only start kicking in towards the highest end, right? Now, this is interesting because we're at a moment where the direction of travel as far as cooling is concerned is this AC curve is very soon going to start mirroring this cooler curve. And the potential that sits in this area, so coolers take about 100, 150 watts, air conditioners are about 1,500 watts. And as we make this transition, it provides a real lever and a moment of intervention where energy efficiency policies at the point of purchase could make dramatic differences to how we shape our consumption patterns. Now, I've been talking a lot about technologies, but transitions are not just about changes in technologies. Transitions are also about changes in behaviors and in practices and how we use these technologies. And what we find actually is that households that have almost the same appliances or the same basket of appliances can have very different energy bills, right? Because the way in which they use what they have is very different. And this is a sort of the role of behavior, the role of practices is something that we have not looked at deeply or at all in our discourse, at least nationally, around consumption and demand. And I just want to point you to these two graphs down here. This is work that we did in Rajkot, which tells us, and I know they look a little bit complicated, but I'll explain them. What we did is we said, let's look at how our models work. Our models use the technology we have, building physical characteristics to make predictions about electricity bills, right? And if we use our structural variables, which if we sort of call them that, we can actually explain only 29% of the electricity bill in our sample. If we then put into the mix behavioral factors, and we did a lot of sort of extensive quantitative and qualitative work in understanding how households use energy, if we put in these behavioral variables and these demographic variables, the amount of variance in the electricity bill that we can explain actually doubles. And you can see that these dots are more clustered towards the line, and the variance goes up by about double, pointing to the fact that we cannot ignore the role of behavior. We cannot ignore how households, how individuals are using what they have. And if we want to think about shaping transitions, shaping consumption patterns, behaviors are really important. Behaviors are also really complicated to understand because going into the realm of examining behaviors, trying to change lifestyle patterns requires thinking through socio-technical transitions and thinking about the interaction not just of technology, but technology and practices, technology and norms, and that's some of the work that we're now beginning to do. And a nice example of that and of how that's changing is that in some of the households that we were studying, we found that the fridge is actually turned off at night. And in our conversations with these households, this is true of a significant portion, it was not just one or two households. The idea was that the norms and the practices around food consumption are such that fresh food is privileged, right? So you don't need to store food overnight because the practices around food consumption are such that you eat fresh food, and so you turn the fridge off. And that is not how we model our energy use. That's not our assumption of how we sort of, in our policy making assumptions of how energy practices unfold. And so thinking through the transitions in behavior and practices and how our energy cultures are changing is also a really important part of this larger demand side transition. Now, I do want to say, and this is just one slide on it, that ultimately what happens in households is embedded within larger urban governance arrangements. And what households do sits within the larger sort of framework of what cities can do and how cities work with the infrastructures they have. And for the city, the infrastructure plays the role of providing multiple objectives, right? So Navroz talked about this a little bit. So the infrastructure provides energy, it provides housing, it provides security, and increasingly is also being used to address climate change. So the questions of climate change have trickled down to the city level, to the municipalities, and a lot of municipal agencies can and sometimes do use their local development priorities as an entry point for climate action. So I'll give you an example. Affordable housing, and we know we're sort of at this moment where there's a rush to build millions of affordable homes in the next few years. Certain cities, Rajkot is again an example here, are using the affordable housing transition and that development transition to also build in passive cooling techniques, right? So what that means is that we have homes that provide housing security, but also homes that will require less energy use because they have been built with passive cooling techniques. And that allows for the structural transition that will be much lower energy consuming and lower carbon than an alternative. Just sort of one point of not caution, but sort of laying out the context a little bit, I think it's important for us to recognize that what cities can do, particularly in the Indian context, while there is a lot that's done at the individual level, at the household level, at the municipal levels, we are in a governance arrangement that is very centralized. And so ultimately, how much cities can do is governed, conditioned, limited by state and central directives, whether that is through funding, through policies, and so sort of, just laying out that context that what a city does or doesn't do is not just up to that city, but it is part of the larger institutional arrangement around energy and climate change that it's part of. So just to end, I really want to make the case and the argument that looking at demand side solutions, particularly for us, is salient because of the impending urbanization, infrastructure, demographic transitions ahead of us. We're poised at the edge of an energy transition. We have enormous unmet energy needs, but we are at an early stage of infrastructure development that really poses an opportunity. We're also in the midst of rapid global technological change, and we have pressures of energy security, climate impacts, and obligations. But the decisions we make today about infrastructure will create path dependencies for future consumption and emission trajectories. And the real question for us is that as we transition, can we re-envision our energy transition to consider these end-use perspectives, to consider how we actually use the energy that we are pursuing to lock in energy efficient and low carbon consumption trajectories?
Thank you very much, Radhika. Fascinating. I think, is it working? Oh, I see. I think this was amazingly interesting, particularly to look fine-grained into how the energy transitions, how the energy demand transitions occur. And you're absolutely right, there is an issue of ownership and there's a separate issue of usage. And very clearly we don't understand that. I remember when we first looked at the fact that the Delhi peak in summers occurs at 11 o'clock at night, we were completely taken aback. Peaks occur during the day at 3 o'clock or whatever. But the 11 o'clock peak apparently is this behavioral shift. All of us who have air conditioners switch them on when we are going to sleep, keep them on for a couple of hours and then they switch off. There was absolutely no way of a priori organizing this and anticipating it, because very clearly, if you're going for solar, there's no sun at 11 p.m. And therefore, what does it mean in terms of energy planning? But I think instead of me going on forever, I think we have had 3 extremely interesting presentations by Michael, Radhika, and Navroz. I look forward to Ashok's presentation on bringing it all together, which itself would be, I'm sure, amazingly interesting. And then we'll open it up for discussion. Ashok, all you have 15, 20 minutes? Oh, yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to do the traditional Indian trick of taking the patli gali and not making too strenuous an effort to try and bring it all together into one coherent narrative or framework, because it's just beyond me. And frankly, I understand the Indian system and the Indian sector much more than the global context. So while I will draw dotted lines to Michael's presentation at the appropriate points, I think my comments or responses will be much more focused on the Indian realities and what I think are important from an Indian point of view. But to begin with what Michael said, and after that the kind of graphs that Navroz was showing, I think it's very interesting to see the graphs that first Michael showed about different countries' evolution trajectories and where India is. And one thing that struck me was that somehow, I don't think it is necessarily through a planned or a coherent approach that we reached there, but we seem to have reached the same per capita energy consumption at a lower, either, if I remember right, or the same per capita GDP at a lower per capita energy consumption. As I said, I don't really know the reasons behind this, but this is an encouraging sign nonetheless that we are able to reach there. Though a small word of caution that I would like to introduce there is, I suppose, please correct me if I'm wrong, these numbers would be of commercial energy consumption. So one of the bigger problems in India, of course, is that we have a lot of non-commercial energy consumption, which is all the biomass that's getting used in the houses. If we add that up, maybe the... In any case, so that's an interesting point that perhaps will be useful. Uh, but coming to the Indian situation, I think Michael's presentation very nicely talked about this whole different strategic approaches that, let's say, a country like Germany or a country like UK took, and the pros and cons of the two approaches. I think that, and partly it kind of comes out from Navroz's presentation, that we as a country, I think one of the bigger challenges we have is to actually have a strategy. Then we can talk about whether it's like what kind of strategy it is and whether it's what are the pros and cons of it. I think if I remember right, the last coherent strategy that we tried to put together for the energy sector was what Surya led the IEP about 12 years ago, and we have not really revisited that in any meaningful manner since then. Each individual ministry, we have multiple ministries that govern the energy sector, each ministry does its own thing, and it's kind of often hard to add them up and see a coherent picture that's emerging, which makes you wonder whether these are being plotted, these pathways are being plotted separately by each of these agencies, or is there any coherent thinking? Just to give you some examples, there has been, for example, a lot of talking in the coal sector of India about making it more efficient and breaking the monopoly of Coal India Limited, bringing in competition. At the same time, you have policies which talk about allocating coal to power companies, which are actually still privileging Coal India over other competitors, which are talking about long-term coal contracts, when, as we all know, the last thing we should be talking about now is locking ourselves into long-term coal contracts. We are not saying that we need to move away from coal very rapidly, but at least you need to start thinking about not locking yourself into 25-year contracts, but think of slightly shorter-term contracts, while the policies, some policies actually say, go the other way and say that you need long-term contracts, only then will you actually get coal. So, there is, and similarly, I think one can talk about other examples such as electric vehicles being pushed on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're talking about, let's say, ethanol as a solution. So, again, is there coherence within the thinking is one question that comes to my mind. And a related question is also about what I said earlier in terms of the fact that the last, at least the document that I'm aware of at a trying to put together a coherent national policy was way back in 2006 or thereabouts. And this, I think another good example is urban governance, where you have master plans for urban areas that get made once for 20 years. You write a document and you believe that that will help you guide your city through for the next 20 years. And of course, you don't refresh it even after 20 years. Usually it happens after 30 years. By the time your entire urban form has changed, the needs have changed, the challenges have changed. So not only do we need actually a more coherent strategic approach to our energy problems, but we also need a more nimble approach. One cannot lock ourselves into even a strategy for that matter, especially in these days and times when the whole sector is changing so rapidly. One needs to be a lot more nimble in terms of addressing these issues. The other thing that I think stands out in the Indian context, which I would like to highlight, again touched upon by both Radhika and Navroz, is the kind of, I would say, complexity arising out of the inherent complexity of a country like India, which to some extent I think distinguishes us from countries in Europe. But if you consider EU as a whole, I think there are similarities to the complexity of India and the complexity of EU in terms of internal inequities, internal disparities across regions, and different, shall we say, political realities across the country. So you're not going to be able to uniformly push a single kind of a strategy or a single kind of a policy regime across the country, given the regional disparities, given the regional inequities, and given the regional dynamics which are different. For example, Navroz touched upon the issue of coal-producing states and the RE-rich states, or the industrially rich states and the agrarian states, and all these issues. And of course, associated with that is also the issue of the changing structure of the economy itself. uh, one does hope that as we move forward, we are not going to have so many people dependent on agriculture and people will move on to other sectors. What are those sectors going to be? What is going to happen to agriculture itself, which is still, as of today, a reasonably big consumer of energy and a significant part of the economy. So how are these changes going to play out as we go forward, and how do we handle these very politically sensitive transitions that we as a country are going to have? And related to that, of course, is the ability of our institutions, the robustness and the capacity of the institutions to be able to deal with these kinds of challenges, and of course the accountability of these institutions to be able to do these things in a very transparent, democratic manner without getting captured by various interests that exist in the country. In that context, actually, Navroz, I want to come back to one point that you made about RE being kind of disruptive, potentially disruptive. I think, at least what we have seen, RE is also potentially disruptive in a very different way, because this is the one sector where we actually have seen it's largely private sector led and not by these big corporate private sectors. You have genuine competition, what I would like to call in the RE sector. You have, I think there are, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 players in the solar space today who are actually winning contracts and building plants. And one of the reasons I believe for the rapid fall in tariffs is also this competitive market and the efficiencies that naturally brings in, which is completely absent from the traditional electricity sector. So I think RE in that sense has also been a disruptor to the market structures in the Indian energy space also. And I think this is a very interesting development which we need to see how it plays out. Whether, again, that also could go both ways. There could be consolidation and there could be capture, and RE would go the way of the conventional energy, or it could actually continue to be the way it is and actually drive the entire sector in a different direction. And we need to really see how that goes. Last probably 2 or 3 points. I think coming to the issue of behavior, which I think Radhika pointed out, I think it's a very, very important factor that I think has not received the kind of attention that it should receive. But as she said, I think there's increasing attention towards that. And another example that I would like to give you, other than the fresh food example that Radhika mentioned, which leads to people switching off refrigerators, is while we are a great supporter of, let's say, initiatives such as the LPG promotion program related to Ujjwala, which is trying to reach out to households all over the country and promote use of LPG. I mean, there are ways in which the program can be improved and enhanced, but nonetheless, the direction is a good one. But a very interesting behavioral challenge there that we see is that in India, in rural households, women typically prefer to cook sitting on the floor. And this is a very deeply ingrained cultural issue. And if you try to use an LPG cylinder with a stove on the floor, it's actually an extremely dangerous use of LPG. And this kind of a cultural change, so this is actually, you're endangering people's lives if you don't address the behavioral changes. It's not just about attaining efficiency faster or attaining, reducing your emissions faster, but you're actually going to put people's lives at danger. And there have been a lot of cases of LPG related accidents that have taken place in households because this factor has not been taken into account. On paper, you do have this. I don't say that the policy has not considered this. On paper, when you give an LPG connection to a new rural household, you're supposed to build a platform there. You're supposed to tell them that you're supposed to put the stove on top. But people invariably just take the stove and put it on the floor and start using it. And it has led to unfortunate cases. And this is just one more example of the many other kinds of behavioral examples that one needs to deal with. And while talking about LPG, I think, and this whole cooking issue, I think I just want to highlight the fact also that while it is very welcome that today in India, air pollution and the challenges related to air pollution are getting higher visibility and there's at least a lot of talk about it, personally, I feel that the talk is still much more A, about outdoor air pollution, and B, especially for somebody who doesn't come from Delhi, very Delhi-centric. I think India is a vast country, there's a huge country out there, and much of the rest of the country also suffers seriously from this problem. And household air pollution problem related to the use of solid cooking fuels, I think is perhaps as big or a bigger problem than outdoor air pollution. And while schemes like Ujjwala do try to make a dent in the problem, I don't think there is a coherent approach to addressing that problem either. Particularly in terms of going beyond Ujjwala to ensuring that people actually use these fuels and use these new technologies that now they have access to so that this problem can be addressed. The last point, which I think is something, is a kind of a pet peeve, not only of me, I think I'm almost sure it's a pet peeve of many people in the room, is that while we want to talk about the transitions and getting, good, having a good strategy, addressing the political economy issues and all those things, one fundamental requirement that is required if you want to actually enable these transitions, provide useful research inputs, is of course the whole question of data. And unfortunately in India, that is a big challenge that we have to grapple with, and particularly on the demand side. I think on the supply side, we are relatively better off. We have kind of better information, but on the demand side, I'm sure Radhika has banged her head against many walls trying to make any sense of the little information that's available out there. And unfortunately, this is a gap that I think is increasing, has not yet been recognized, and this needs to be addressed urgently if we really want to be able to do some good research and provide input. For example, one data point that always flummoxes me is that if you look at the official Indian data, NSSO produced data on appliance ownership and appliance usage. Firstly, the two very important appliances that Radhika showed in terms of air conditioners and air coolers are clubbed into one category. They're not even separated out. So you don't know how many Indians actually own air conditioners versus coolers. And even that datum, NSSO says that 1 in 4 Indian households owns an AC or a cooler. A data point that I just cannot believe is right. There's no way 1 in 4 Indian households can own an AC or a cooler, and that's the number that NSSO officially puts out. So given this kind of problems, we really think that this is one of those unstated problems that's really at the root of many of the things that perhaps hinder us from doing better in terms of better research, better policies, strategies, and so on for the Indian energy sector. I think I have pretty much completed.
Many thanks. I must say, Ashok, I'm always impressed by the way you're able to bring things together, and today is no exception. I think Ashok deserves a round of applause.